Good morning and welcome to the America's Role in the World panel session on Global Russia. My name is Alicia Kirchhoff, and I am a current PhD student at Indiana University in the Department of Sociology. My research interests include the global legal profession and issues of law and society in hybrid regimes, with an emphasis on Russia and Eurasia. My current project is a comparative study on institutional trust, law, and governance in Russia, China, and Latin America. I'm working with sociology professor Ethan Michelson, who is the academic co-director of the China Gateway program at IU. Support for my involvement in this project, and indeed much of the work I have done at Indiana, has come from the Russian and East European Institute, where I have benefited from FLAS fellowship support and the REI Mellon Conference Support Fund. I also have the honor of being a Russian Studies Workshop Fellow at IU, which has supported professional development opportunities and my pre-dissertation research. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Director of the Russian and East European Institute and moderator of today's panel, Professor Sarah Phillips. Professor Phillips is an expert on Central and Eastern Europe in the areas of post-socialist transformations, civil society, NGOs, globalization, development, and gender. Her work on Ukraine and Russia spans across topics of health and medicine, including disability issues, HIV/AIDS, and addiction. As director of REEI, Professor Phillips' charge includes program development and oversight, as well as shaping the intellectual identity of one of the nation's leading programs on Russia and East European studies. REEI has an expansive community of scholars and students across disciplines on campus. Alumni of the Institute apply their expertise in government, business, education, and related fields. As a Department of Education Title VI program, REEI administers fellowships, supports language and area studies training at all levels, and actively participates in community engagement across Indiana for anyone from pre-K students to community college instructors. With support from the Mellon Endowment, REEI funds scholarly research and professional development in the form of dissertation support and faculty grants in aid of research. Importantly, REEI is also the institutional home for the Russian Studies Workshop at IU, an initiative funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Thanks to the incredible efforts of REEI faculty affiliates, namely Professor Regina Smith of Political Science, this project has funded dozens of critical, timely initiatives that have advanced scholarship in the social sciences on Russia at Indiana and beyond. These combined efforts, along with SGIS and campus-level support, have helped to solidify Indiana's place as a national leader for the study of contemporary Russia. Thank you again for joining us today. I will now turn the podium, or the microphone, over to Professor Phillips to introduce the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alicia. It's really my distinct pleasure to be able to moderate this panel this morning on Global Russia. Please be aware that I am giving only the briefest of bios for our distinguished panelists. You may refer to your conference bulletin for more information. So I'll just start by introducing our four panelists, and then we will launch right into a conversation, after which we will turn the floor over to questions from the audience. I'm very pleased to introduce Ambassador James Collins, who was U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001, and served as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 1990 to 93. Ambassador Collins is co-chair of the Board of Directors of the U.S.-Russia Foundation. He is also a diplomat in residence at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'm proud to say that Ambassador Collins is also an alumnus of Indiana University. Next, Maria Lipman, distinguished journalist and editor, a much sought-after expert on the international media circuit. From 2003 to 2014, Maria Lipman was the editor-in-chief of Pro et Contra, a policy journal published by the Carnegie Moscow Center. She's currently editor-in-chief of Counterpoint, or Kontrapunkt, journal published by George Washington University's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. From 2001 to 2011, Maria Lipman wrote an op-ed column on Russian politics, media, and society for the Washington Post, and since 2002, she has written a monthly blog for the New Yorker online. No stranger to Indiana University, Maria Lipman is in her second semester as a distinguished visiting lecturer here in the School of Global and International Studies. Dr. Andrew Kuchins was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from 2000 to 2006. He was director of the Carnegie Moscow Center in Russia from 2003 to 2005. He's currently a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. And I just learned that his son is also a graduate of Indiana University. Finally, Dr. Celeste Wallander served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia from 2009 to 2012. And from 2013 to 2017, she served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia, Eurasia on the National Security Council. Dr. Wallander is currently President and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Foundation. So as you can see, we have a much distinguished panel of speakers here to launch into a conversation about the following: global Russia. This could not be a more timely topic. So I'd like to ask our panelists to briefly respond to the question, what kind of global power is Russia today? What are Russia's foreign policy aims? What should be the U.S. response? Now, this is a huge question. We won't cover all aspects of it in our initial round of remarks, but I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Collins. What kind of global power is Russia? What are Russia's foreign policy aims?
Okay, I want to sort of put 4 questions on the table in response that touch on these. The first one is it a global power? We had President Obama, who said it was a regional power. I think it's fair to say, though, that today people see it as having global reach as a nation. It's not the same as ours by any means, but Russia increasingly appears involved or engaged in societies and countries on pretty much every continent on the globe. So it is a global power in the sense that it has global reach, and more to the point, it now has established itself as requiring a place at the global table for most internationally significant issues. The second question, I think, is what do we think about Russia as a global player? What is its role? Now, Russia has recovered from a collapse following the Soviet disintegration that was dramatic. But it has restored its economy, it's restored its military, it has restored a political system, maybe not the one we would hope, but a political system that functions. And it is, at the moment, presenting itself in a way as an alternative to what was discussed yesterday by a number of panelists, the liberal democratic model, both in terms of its political structures and the values that it puts forth, and to a degree in terms of the way it functions in its economy. So the question we have here is, why are we obsessed with Russia? Well, we're obsessed essentially because Russia is putting a challenge in front of us. It is suggesting that there is an alternative to the, if you will, American model globalization dynamic that has shaped so much of the world in this century so far. Third, I think, is the question of how do you get Russia right? What is Russia today? And here I want to suggest a couple of thoughts that I think are important as one begins to try to understand this country. First of all, this is a new state. I was once in charge of what were called the new independent states, and everybody kept thinking about 14 of them. Actually, there were 15, because Russia was a new state too. Old society, old culture, but as a political entity with the borders it came to have after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, it is a new state. And so one of the most relevant factors about this country, from my point of view, is that it still searches for its own identity as a national entity, as a nation state, something it's never been. It's always been an empire. Now it's trying to settle its position as a nation state and to define a position in the global community. And it's having one hard time. And I would submit to you that one of the most difficult parts of this process is something we're a bit familiar with today too, but it is the truism that Russia is a country with an unpredictable past. The reality is that whereas societies like ours, or most of the European liberal democracies, depend on a historic tradition, a historic narrative that they accept, the Russians can't agree. And the example I give you is that last year was the 100th anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Probably the thing that shaped the lives of 2/3 of the Russian population. And yet they couldn't figure out how to talk about it. Had it been 25 years ago, it would have been the ultimate holiday celebration. I mean, I can just imagine the amount of red bunting. But the fact was they could not figure out what to say. I simply would say, by comparison, our efforts to deal with the reality of a slavery past, I won't say pales in comparison, but it is something that is much more manageable within the discussion of our society.
Celeste, Wallander,
Yeah.
how would you?
I want to add
Oh,
one
yes.
more thing. And then the fourth question I think we need to talk about is the famous Russian question of что делать? What do you do? What do we do with a country that's going to be an adversary, almost certainly for as long as we can foresee out for the next several years? How do we approach this country? I have to say that we're not doing very well. Our relations are probably as bad as they've been any time since the Cold War. Our engagement continues to decline. We are engaged in the process of trying to make the Russians do what we want by compulsion, sanctions, throwing out diplomats, etc. It's not working very well. And so the question is, what do we do to try to find a new approach to this problem? I think the following 3 or 4 things are important. One is we have to know ourselves what we want from the Russian relationship. And I would submit to you at the moment, if you go to Washington and ask that question, you will get no consensus about anything. We want them to behave, I think, is probably what you might conclude. They have a rather different view. Secondly, we need to marshal our own assets, our strengths, to use in the development of a relationship with this country. And that means we need to find a way to deal with our adversary from a position of unity, something that we're not doing at the moment. We also need to marshal our allies and bring them together, something that I think, at least in response to the terrible poisoning in England a few weeks ago, at least sounds like we're trying now, getting the allies together. Third, we do need to engage them. Now, I think the basis on which you start is essentially to use those areas where we already have something cooperative in place and take advantage of that. Space station, implementing the reduction in strategic arms, and so forth. And fourth, it seems to me we need to do whatever we can to work with the society level engagement and structures which allow us to build a platform from which we can have a better relationship, because the Russians will see it of value. And there, I think the idea of cutting our ties with things like exchange students and so forth that has been done in the past is playing Putin's game. Putin wants to cut things off. We should be doing exactly the opposite, of opening ourselves to those we believe will be important in shaping the future and with whom we share enough to make it a positive development. So let me stop there. Sorry to be over time.
Thank you, Ambassador Collins. That was a wonderful entree to the conversation. So Celeste, Wallander, how would you respond? Is this the way you too see Russia feeling its way as a global power? And I'd be especially interested to hear you talk about the kind of societal level interventions that can be made, particularly with the work you do with the U.S.-Russia Foundation.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Thanks to you all for inviting me here again. Can't claim to have been to every conference, but at least I'm an alum of last year's, and it's really wonderful to be here and be able to be part of this conversation. I'm going to flip the question a little. I want to start with what core reasons drive Russian foreign policy, and then turn to the question of what does that mean for Russia as a global power. And I think the core of what drives Russian policy is actually similar to the theme of this conference, which is that foreign policy begins at home. What drives Russian foreign policy right now is the priority of the Russian elite to preserve Putinism. Putinism used to be contentious, but now everyone agrees, I think pretty much, is an authoritarian system of a particular caste. It's one based on patron-client relationships and control of a fundamentally corrupt economic system in which access to power means you have access to the creation and distribution and control of rents, which is sort of excess money sloshing around in the system. And to get access to rents, you have to have political power. So there's an internal loop between wealth, and not wealth out of sort of what we think of as the kind of growth that comes from globalization, but out of control of assets in the system. And that is the core of what Putinism is. And I want to build on what Ambassador Collins said, which is the biggest threat to Putinism's survival doesn't come from inside Russia, doesn't come from opposition, political figures. It could someday come from civil society. It could come from businesses that have an interest in not a corrupt Russian economy, but actually a competitive, growing, innovative economy. But right now, what really threatens Putinism is the global system. Openness, globalization, flows of information, investor rights, shareholder rights, transparency, all of those elements of globalization that are disruptive, and we see the effects here in the United States, and we see it in Europe and other places. They're disruptive, but that's how the global system generates change, growth, and dynamism. And so the Putin elite has got itself stuck, because in order to retain power at home, it has to close off those sources of uncontrolled globalization, and that is why we have seen increasing ownership of the energy sector by individuals close to Vladimir Putin. Now, that said, what Putinism ultimately also needs is access to the goods of the international system, because access to investment funds, access to technology, expertise, scientific exchange requires being open to the international system. And so in the end, the Putin elite is playing a losing game. And that comes to what I would say about what is a global Russia. I think it is a Russia with global reach. I wouldn't consider it to be a global power, because it can't necessarily affect events across the global system in a positive way. And I don't mean positive as in we like it, but as in achieving objectives out in the international system, because they're stuck with this system at home that is in many regards incompatible. And we heard elements of this yesterday in the panel discussion on China as well. The Chinese elite is facing much the same dilemma. And so Russia may be a power with global reach, but it is a declining power with global reach. I have a few statistics to give you, just to give you a sense of this. Russia has fallen to 12th in the world in GDP. It is 61st in GDP per capita, 61st in GDP per capita. I don't have time to list all the countries that are above it. It's 18th in foreign direct investment, far below all of the other emerging economies, and many of the emerging economies that are much smaller and even have lower growth rates than Russia. Foreign investment fell from $70 billion per year in 2014 to it's now up to $32.5 billion in 2016. And that's because international business and international investors are voting with their feet, and they're not going to Russia. And so the sources of dynamism that any country in this competitive global system needs are not inside of Russia. So Russia is a country with extensive military reach, although it's more regional reach. That is, it's just a big region. Eurasia is a very big region. But it doesn't have what makes ultimately for the fundamentals of global power, which is a dynamic, competitive, responsive economy. And as long as the primary goal of the leadership is to preserve the system inside of Russia, it's going to be limited and falling further and further and further behind other emerging economies that are open to the international system, and right now to a China that is also not a global power, but a power with global reach, but a rising power. And that's the dilemma for the Russian leadership. And I've run out of time in terms of what we should do about this, but I'll be happy to address that a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Kuchins, how would you intervene in this conversation? I know you too have been a little skeptical about the whole concept of global Russia, and is Russia a global power, and if it is, what kind? So please.
Thanks, Sarah. It's wonderful to be here. Shout out to Hoosier Nation. My son graduated here last May. He graduated in 4 years, yes. He got a great education, he has a great set of friends, he has a great job in Chicago, he's loving it. So thank you, Indiana University. And thank you, Dean Feinstein, for the invitation here. And it's wonderful to see Senator Lugar here, the co-author of only second to probably the Marshall Plan, the most important U.S. assistance program in history, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, colloquially known as the Nunn-Lugar Program. So, contrary to my usual contrarian nature, I will follow Sarah's instructions of answering the questions that she asked us to look at. Just on Putinism, I would agree with everything that Celeste said about the characteristics of Putinism, but I would say that, look, this is a reversion to traditional Russian political culture, okay? Patrimonial system, highly centralized, authoritarian, etc. I mean, you talk about the princes of Muscovy, you can talk about the Tsarist Empire, you can talk about the Soviet Union, and the exceptions to this really were the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, and to some extent, maybe very briefly in 1917 after the February Revolution. So, Russia, global power, weak or strong? It's hard to evaluate that. Remember. Bismarck said, Russia is never as weak as it looks, and it's never as strong as it looks. And I would add to that the Russians always want to make you think that they're much stronger than they may actually be, the sort of the Potemkin village phenomenon. So let me just go through some of the strengths of Russia. Well, okay, they have a nuclear deterrent. They reached nuclear parity with the United States in the Soviet period. That's the keystone of their security. They do have improved conventional forces, but I would be careful about overstating that. Let's remember where Russian conventional forces were in the 1990s. They effectively lost a civil war in their own territory in Chechnya. They are an energy superpower in that they do have the largest amount of hydrocarbons, oil and gas reserves combined in the world. They do have a UN Security Council veto that they wield. The weaknesses are pretty much, I think, the core one that Celeste got to. It's the economy, stupid, to paraphrase Bill Clinton. But, I mean, this is a traditional weakness for Russia. I mean, the historian Alfred Reber wrote about persistent factors of Russian foreign policy, and it's one of the four is economic backwardness and technological backwardness. Russia's, it is hard, I think, is building on both what Celeste and Ambassador Collins said, that it's hard to right-size the problem, all right? Some people in Washington are saying that, look, one of my best friends, look, Putin is going to fall in the next year. Now, he's been predicting that for 14 years. One of these years, he's going to be right. I don't think it's going to be in the next few years, though. I will hazard that. But, a broken clock is right twice a day. And then others, I think, tend to focus on this, sort of this enormous Goliath that Russia has become. And Russia's power is not near to what the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. And that's a really fundamental difference. You know, less than 10% of the US GDP, less than 10% of US military spending, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, what are its goals? The goals are, you know, one, to become, for Mr. Putin, to become a great power again. When he became the president of the Russian Federation, Russia was in danger of really losing great power status. So that's been a consistent goal of Russia, and to be respected as a great power. They want to have privileged interests in the countries on their periphery, the smaller countries on their periphery. That's been a core goal since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are a revisionist power to some extent, in that they want to undo, they see some of the changes in the international system that they see as happened during a period of weakness, and that the West, and particularly the United States, took unfair advantage of them, and so they don't find them entirely legitimate. In that regard, they are somewhat revisionist. They do want to contest U.S. hegemony and U.S. unilateralism. That's been continuous, and they do, I think, also want to divide our European allies and play on their own differences. Finally, the tools. Well, I think the tools are what you look at when you look at the strengths. It's their position in the UN, military strength, energy, cyber. Obviously, that's been a big issue in the last couple of years. Intelligence resources. I mean, the Russian intelligence is present in the United States and around the world as it was during the Cold War, although maybe a little bit less so since the expulsions of Russian intelligence officers last week. So those are, again, the tools. I'll stop right there because I think my time is up, and the other questions that I think Sarah's going to put forward to us will give an opportunity to elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Maria Lipman, it's really important to look at what is going on the ground in Russia. So if you can help us take the flip side, I know you follow Russian media very closely, Russian public opinion very closely. What do the average citizens of Russia think about all of this? And what is your perspective as someone who lives half of the year in Moscow, half of the year in Bloomington?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for everyone who contributed to my invitation here. The list would be too long. I'm truly, truly grateful. It's really delightful to be here, especially since this is my second semester, and second time I've had the honor to be invited to this conference, so thank you so much. I will be really glad to answer your question, but to begin with, I would like to respond to a couple points that I heard so far. And the first one was a point made by Celeste. And Celeste, you said that Russian foreign policy is driven domestically. I would not say that it is not driven domestically. However, I think I would not underestimate the factor that Andy just mentioned. Putin sees Russia, and I mean Putin personally, Putin as the leader and Putin as a person, sees Russia as great, as a country that should be great. And he's been saying this since even before becoming acting president. And I refer to his Millennium Manifesto, his programmatic article published in '99, in which he was talking about Russia always should be great. This was before he built the system that he now presides over. I think to him, this is a paramount goal. And at this point in time, over the past few years, he's ready to pay for it, to pay the cost. That is the cost of Russian development. He sacrifices development for the sake of greatness, however understood. So I think this should not be underestimated. It's not domestic only. And I would also respond to something that Ambassador Collins said, that Russia is a new country and is groping for a new identity. I cannot agree more. And the example that Ambassador Collins cited, celebration, or rather in non-celebration, 1917, was really remarkable in this respect. And now to your question. I'm not judging the foreign policy of the United States and the West, and I think it is it's not up to me to decide, because we should take into considerations what are the goals of that policy. What I would like to say is that the policy of sanctions and angry rhetoric, and not infrequently name-calling, has had a very serious impact on the public opinion at home. And this is quite an achievement, I would say. Negative, positive, it's a different question, but the difference has been huge. Now, the impact is, of course, on the perception of the United States, of Russian-American relations, and also the impact on how Putin's own or the Kremlin's propaganda is perceived these days. Putin has said for years, at least since 2004, that democracy promotion and support of non-government organizations and assistance, in fact, has nefarious goals. The Russian people at large, I would say, were not paying too much attention. Liberal Westernizers like myself, people in my circle, of course, not just didn't believe it, but we thought we had a very strong argument. And the argument was, of course, we do not believe that Western leaders or American presidents go to bed and wake up every day with the sole purpose of doing our country harm. It's not that our compatriots listened to us or regarded us as an authority, but at least that gave us a sense of confidence and righteousness. And this is not true anymore, because the West is there to do us harm. What else? This is sanctions. Sanctions are about punishing. And this is really a very difficult dilemma for people who are Westernizers and who do care about liberal values. Let me quote a Russian columnist. This is a man who is a harsh critic of Putin, is not at all shy to write about it, basically on a daily basis, is quite prominent, has a large following online. This is what he wrote a couple of weeks ago, maybe. The position of a Westernizer, which has been traditional for certain groups of Russians, is least justified today compared to any other historical period when one could assume that at least somebody in the West wishes us good. Nobody wishes us good today. And I know Celeste will be able, and I hope she will, tell us what is the good that America is trying to do, but I'm talking about the perception. And this perception has become really, really broad. This kind of perception means that people like myself, my circle, are losing credibility entirely with our compatriots. And we also are losing the sense of righteousness and are facing a moral dilemma. Now, the decline, the fact that the West is declaring that we want to we're imposing sanctions in order to do harm to Russia, to weaken it, to punish it. Punish is the word. Actually proves Putin's right. To many people, this means he's been right all along. Today's anti-Americanism is quite different from the anti-Americanism of the Soviet days, of the Soviet Union, when it was a crucial element, of course, of the official propaganda. But Soviet people, I'm talking about late decades of the Soviet Union, paid lip service to this propaganda. America was, back then, a source of so many things desired and so many things denied to the Russian people, to the Soviet people at the time. And one of those things was truth. And people, millions of Soviet people, looked for truth, listening to the Voice of America and other Western radio stations. For the anti-Soviet liberals, to which I certainly belonged, this meant that we had a comfortable position. Siding with the West, siding with the United States, was not acting against our country. It was against communism. And it was a comfortable position to have the West as our ally. Today, it is not possible anymore. Today, to side with the West is to alienate from a majority, a vast majority of your fellow countrymen and from your country. This is why I'm saying this is a dilemma. The anti-Americanism of today is broad and it is genuine. It comes up in casual conversations. It comes up in focus groups. In today's Russia, we do not have an overarching ideology. The government does not demand that. One can be a monarchist or a Stalinist or a fan of Brezhnev or a religious fundamentalist. One can be a radical nationalist. But anti-Americanism has become a common denominator. And it has become a surrogate ideology in Russia today. This anti-Americanism today is what gives a boost to Putin's legitimacy and what rallies the nation around the leader. The effect that has been lasting at least since the annexation of Crimea, and we're talking about an approval rating of over 80% ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Anti-Americanism is what helps Putin in his policy of pitting his conservative majority against activists, against Westernizers, branding them agents of the West, and this works. And again, I want to say I'm not judging this policy, but I think Western leaders and everyone interested should be aware of this impact of that policy.
Thank you. Maria, you have painted a very bleak picture that I think may come as a surprise to many people. Celeste, Wallander, what can we do? What can we do to repair these relationships? And where does it start?
I may disappoint you because I don't think that's where the answer starts. The answer starts as an American, and it is what are American national interests? And as we heard yesterday, American national interests since the end of World War II have been primarily supported, advanced, and protected by the set of global institutions, international law, the international rule of law embedded in the UN, in the OSCE, in NATO, in arms control treaties, and a whole host of institutions and treaties and legal structures that were explicitly designed to do two things: prevent the kind of all-out warfare and conflict that we saw just almost destroy the world twice in the 20th century. And second, to create the conditions to support globalization, to support the protection of international investment, to support freer trade, to lower trade barriers, to lower barriers to educational exchange. That system, as Americans, we shouldn't be apologetic about that. That's in our national interests. I happen to think that would be in Russia's national interests. I happen to think this paranoia about being a great power is driven by the regime. And in fact, the actions that the regime is taking are going to drive Russia away from being a modern great power in the sort of fantastical pursuit of what a 19th century great power was. But that's for Russians to choose. As an American, all I can say is that that system of rules and institutions and international law protect us, protect our allies, and advance our interests, and we should defend it. And since Putinism is incompatible with those rules, you are seeing the Russian leadership attempt to knock down those rules, either by trying to change them through negotiation or by simply ignoring or undermining them. New START is an incredibly important treaty. It is the only arms control treaty that Russia is legally obligated to at this point that it is actually following. It is violating the CFE treaty, it is violating the Open Skies treaty, it is violating the INF treaty, and it may be violating the chemical weapons ban, as we saw with the use of a chemical agent, a military-grade chemical agent against a civilian in Britain this month. So, and I could go through many rules. Not changing borders through use of force, that violates the fundamental rules of the UN Charter and the rules of European security that the Russian government itself signed up to at the end of the Cold War as a condition for being accepted into the international community with all the rights and responsibilities of the Soviet Union. Russia didn't necessarily get that UN Security Council seat as a permanent member. It was a decision of the international community to allow Russia to succeed to that Soviet seat in exchange for agreeing to play by the international rules of the game. So those are the stakes for the United States. I don't welcome this. I don't like this. I had other intentions and desires as a scholar, an analyst, and then when I served in the Obama administration. But we have to recognize that our first priority has to be advancing and protecting the American national interest. And where possible, we should cooperate with Russia. So we should sustain the New START treaty. I strongly believe that we should be more actively seeking a negotiation with Russia to bring it back into compliance with the INF treaty, the CFE treaty, and the Open Skies treaty, because those are valuable arms control agreements. I, during my time in the Obama administration, worked with my colleagues at the State Department on multiple negotiations to try to bring Russia back into compliance with its obligations under the UN Charter and all the European security institutions with respect to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. So those are important elements of a US national security policy. But I would just propose to you or argue to you that cooperation for cooperation's sake is not what should drive US policy towards any country, and not Russia. Cooperation is a tool, it's not the goal. And it is a tool that can serve our interests, and often in history has served our interests. And we should be open to that, and we should be looking for opportunities with Russia, the Russian government, to cooperate. One last point to answer your other question, and I fully agree with what Ambassador Collins and Andy both pointed out, and I think it underlines what Masha said, even though she didn't say it, which is what we should not be doing is closing off Russia as a country. While official relations are difficult, while the actions of the Putin leadership are problematic, we need to recognize that, but that doesn't mean closing off the country. And that's why I get very impatient with this sort of rhetoric of a new Cold War and new containment. That is exactly what will help the Putin regime resist the international rules of the game and work against American interests. We should maintain society-to-society relationships. We should encourage scientific exchange. We should welcome Russian students, welcome Russian business people. We should welcome the opportunity to keep Russia open to the international system, because that's good for the United States. It's good, I believe, for Russia, and it is not giving in to what the Russian political elite seeks to do, which is for it to be able to go to London and Paris and Rome, but not to allow Russian society to have that kind of free flow.
Andrew Kuchins, you had a response.
Yeah, just what do I think that the United States should do? I'd make several points. One of the most fundamental things, especially looking at what happened in the 2016 elections, is reduce the dysfunctionality and the disunity in our own political system. The Russians did not create this dysfunctionality in the U.S. political system. We did. They play upon those vulnerabilities. They manipulate those vulnerabilities to advance their interests. But the fundamental problem is with us, and so to get our own house in order. Two, I think I would emphasize again, don't underestimate Mr. Putin. This guy has been around for 18 years, basically running Russia. That's not exactly an easy thing to do. He's turned out to be a much more effective politician, both domestically in Russia and on the international stage, than anybody anticipated. Nobody really saw this coming. And the system is much more resilient than I think that many give it credit. And Putin himself he's fairly predictable. His goals have been the same pretty much for 18 years. I don't understand why we get so surprised when he does things. It's true he's gotten more risk, he's gotten less risk averse in the last 4 years. But basically, I mean, I won't go into the details of it, but he's fairly predictable in my view. I want to just elaborate on some of the problems with the sanctions. One, obviously, as Masha mentioned, there's the rally around the flag effect. Two, it gives Putin a very convenient excuse to point to the West trying to weaken Russia for the dysfunction of the Russian economy and the structural problems in the Russian economy. Three, actually, it works very nicely for Mr. Putin politically, not only for those reasons, but because it takes away the Western financial markets and institutions as an outlet for Russian businesses and business people to go to, and that makes it easier for him to control the revenue flows inside Russia. And then, particularly if you look at the impact, I think, of the most recent sanctions, the CATSA legislation from August of this year, it's the threat of these much greater sanctions that is causing a great inflow of Russian capital coming back to Russia right now. And let me tell you, the Russians are very good at moving money around. They're pretty clever about this, and this is also helping. And the larger thing about sanctions is, well, there are two things. One, the reason why sanctions can work is because of the hegemony of the United States dollar in the international financial system. Okay, for reasons because of the changing balance of power in the global economy, that hegemony is eroding already by itself. But by continually using sanctions, it gives others, they'd be concerned about U.S. sanctions, and so they would like to accelerate, make themselves less vulnerable to these kinds of tools, and I think it accelerates the process of the erosion of the U.S. dollar. Finally, do they actually work? I mean, hey, we sanctioned Castro's Cuba for more than 50 years. Guess what? His younger brother is still running Cuba. I think that's a controversial question. The last point I would make is that, and this related to the sanctions and the financial sanctions issue, is that actually there's a much larger problem out there, and that is the complicitness of our financial and legal institutions in massive money laundering of Russian money since the Soviet Union collapsed. And it's not only Russian money, it's Chinese money and others. Ed Luce of the Financial Times wrote a terrific article yesterday about this issue. And we have created that vulnerability ourselves. And that is an issue that needs greater attention, and it's much larger than Russia.
Thank you, Andrew. Interventions now from Ambassador Collins and Masha, and then we will open the floor for questions. So please, Ambassador Collins.
I just want to put one thing on the table. I think Congressman Hamilton yesterday said, you need to think about objectives and you need to match resources to your objectives. So we have to start where we are today. I mean, I think is the first point. We're not able to start where we'd like to, say in 1991 or 10 years ago. And so what are our objectives? What are our real national objectives with respect to the Russian Federation today? And I would submit there are a couple that are probably most important. One is that this country succeed in holding itself together and retaining a political structure that can certainly have control, responsible control of its nuclear armed forces, of its nuclear weapons. That is the biggest challenge to us, no matter what. It was the biggest challenge in 1990, 90, 89, 90, 91, 92. How do you ensure that those weapons don't get off, in hands that we would really worry about? Secondly, I think we want to see that the stability and cohesion of this region is sustained. Now, our policy has been, and it's a perfectly valid policy, that all of Russia's neighbors, the new states and so on, have every right to independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and so forth. And we should stand for that. I don't have no qualms about that. On the other hand, it's also true that we are not probably going to spend a huge amount of treasure and money to ensure that that is achieved. We need to bring the Russians to accept that that is possible, compatible with some of their own most important interests. And I don't think we've done that. Clearly we didn't, because we have Ukraine. Now, that means going forward, we have some very serious challenges to define our own goals in terms of what's possible and what is going to achieve our most vital interests. And I think here I don't agree with Celeste in some ways. I understand what you're saying about the past agreements, but CFE is dead. It's not coming back. So what are you going to put in its place? CFE was the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement. It limited how many tanks you could have and so on. I mean, this is the past. The question is, what are you going to put in its place? And I can tell you, I don't know how many hours I spent trying to persuade people that you weren't able to stuff today's reality back into the 20th century bottle. So that's going to be our challenge. And we're not taking it, I think, seriously enough. We're not thinking about our own objectives. Now, I agree with Celeste. We want international order, and we want to engage China, Russia, and some of the other players in the new international order of the 21st century that's going to survive. Trying to restore the one of the 20th century isn't going to happen. So the principles may be right, but we have to adapt them to today's realities. And I'm afraid in that sense, we have not really come to terms with reality.
Maria Lipman, how would you respond?
Thank you. We're talking about global nations, and nobody has the doubt that the US has a global nation. And this means that the responsibility of a global nation is to take care of security, not only domestically, not only national security, but international security as well. And then my question is, as the policy toward Russia is increasingly reduced to punishing and to pressure, does it make the world more secure? We live in a world right now, relations between Russia and the US, where diplomacy is increasingly reduced to expelling diplomats. And does this make the world more secure? It is natural, I can understand that and even sympathize, to respond with punishing vis-a-vis Russian policy and Russian behavior in the world. But this is a reaction driven by frustration. It's driven more by emotion than about far-reaching goals. And I know that what Ambassador Collins has just said, it's a huge challenge, really huge. But without actually accepting it and rising to this challenge, I think this tit for tat, this vicious circle, this logic of international relations that makes our countries more hostile to each other and not friendly or not more cooperative will continue. One very last point. Celeste, you mentioned that the US should welcome businessmen. I think this is, in a nutshell, shows just how hard is the challenge. How do you welcome businessmen when Russia is under sanctions and Russian businessmen are increasingly seen with suspicion, even those who are not under sanctions? And the other way around, Russian businessmen are concerned and I think are not without a reason to deal with their American counterparts.
I'm not sure that's what Celeste said, so.
Just a clarification
Yes.
about sanctions. And I am not going to defend the rather sledgehammer sanctions that this administration and this Congress has applied. I'll talk a little bit about what the sanctions that the Obama administration imposed on Russia as a result of the intervention in Crimea and Donbass. Those were carefully crafted sanctions to name individuals in the Russian leadership who were responsible for the decisions to violate international law covertly. Not so covertly. It was not a very good covert operation since footprints were all over it, but it was intended to be covert. And the economic sanctions were deliberately chosen to target not business people generally, but specifically the cronies who are part of this corrupt circle around President Putin and who probably are responsible for hiding his money. You know, there's this myth out there that you can sanction Putin by, draining his bank accounts. He doesn't have any bank accounts. He's smart. He's exactly smart. He knows not to have any bank accounts in his own name or that of his family. The bank accounts are held and the assets are held by the people around him. So the sanctions were meant to exactly affect the decision makers, not the country. And there were and when there were sectoral sanctions, there was an explicit decision, for example, not to sanction current energy production, international energy production, but future energy production, to impose costs that would not actually hurt our European allies, because we need them to join in, but also to not hurt the wide swath of the Russian economy. Andy is right about how the dollar is becoming less and less important globally, but if the United States were to impose sanctions on Russia that prevented any Russian institution from dealing in dollars, the economy would be gone in a week. A lot of the European economy would be gone a week, and the global economy would take a big hit. And the American economy would be less hurt than the European economies, but it would obviously be hurt because of the knock-on effects. That's why we didn't do it. So the notion that sanctions are emotional and for punishment, I appreciate from the outside it looks like that, but they were actually, I spent more time working on this than you can imagine, and even more time than trying to save CFE or missile defense cooperation on this. And the idea was to raise the costs on exactly the elite decision makers. Did it get Russia out of Ukraine? No, but it achieved the objective, which was to stop the escalation and create space for diplomatic negotiations in Minsk. You would have, it's Nislo China that Russia agreed to Minsk I after the imposition of American and European sectoral sanctions. They realized that they couldn't continue in the fall of 2014 to militarily escalate with impunity, and they went to the negotiation table. We still don't have a settlement, but we do not have the full-blown war in Ukraine that it looked like we were going to get in fall of 2014.
Andrew Kuchins, very quickly,
Well,
please.
Look, I think the sanctions played a role in the Russian calculations about thinking about going forward, but there are other factors as well, and I would accentuate the military factor. If the Russians actually did try to create this land corridor to Crimea, which was everybody thought they were going to do in Washington in the winter and spring of 2015, it would have been a bloodbath. The risk-reward ratio was just too costly for them to go forward, so I wouldn't discount that. I guess my problem, sanctions we can debate about, but I suppose my problem at the time with our policy was it was easy to focus on the punish Russia part. The harder parts was how do you help Ukraine, okay? And how do you help Ukraine, which has been a criminally corrupt country for more than a quarter of a century? I mean, the Ukrainians, they make the Russians look like kindergartners when it comes to a corrupt political system. Sorry, you may not like it, but that's certainly my view. And secondly, I don't think we put enough efforts into resolving the diplomatic problem. We kind of outsourced it to the Europeans. I was thinking to myself, where is the diplomats? Dick, help me out, in the 1990s, resolving Bosnia and, Dick Holbrooke, Why aren't we engaged in that more? That to me was kind of a frustration. Those were the much harder things to do. And the easier thing to do was to punish Russia. To what effect I think is debatable.
I have a feeling we'll continue this conversation in the cloakroom. But for now, let's open it to questions from the audience. Please wait for the microphone. Please make your question a question and keep it short. And we will try to take as many as we can. And in turn, please make your responses short if possible. If you have a question that's directed to a particular panelist, please make that clear. So please, I'm not sure where you have a microphone and you have a microphone. So right here.
Hi, thank you very much. The question is actually open for all of you. My question centers on the mindset of young Russians in Putin's Russia concerning liberty versus stability. As Americans, the idea that we would ever sacrifice our liberty for stability is basically anathema to us. Granted, we don't have the lengthy history of invasion that Russia as a whole has endured. But despite the perpetual window on the West and the globalization that has occurred since the end of the Cold War, we know that there remains much support among young Russians for Putin. My question is this largely a preference of economic and political stability over liberty, or are there other factors at stake?
Take that one, Masha.
Thank you. This is an excellent question, and I'm very happy to refer to you to two very good publications in English recently that appeared just prior to the Russian presidential election, one in the Washington Post and the other in The Economist, both about young people, and they chose to talk to those who turned 18, 19, so first-time voters at the presidential election. There were other interesting surveys done about that. Your assessment is correct. The young people turned out to be to support the regime in larger numbers, in higher proportion than the population at large. And the dilemma, the way you worded it, it's not how they view it, and it's not how they. It's not the framework that they use when they look at the regime. I would say that the dominant line that appears in actually all of these publications and surveys is that the young population lives better than their parents. And this is a factor in any country. And they say this when asked and even when not asked. Life is not bad for them. And they listen to their parents when they were their age, roughly in the 90s, when life was very hard, and they have more opportunity. It is limited, especially if they are in the provinces. But both publications, to the credit of both papers, the British and the Washington Post, they talk to people in the provinces, not just in Moscow. They think that life is interesting enough. They have fun, they have time, they have leisure. They look into the future, not with great expectations, but certainly not expecting things to get worse. Maybe they're wrong, maybe they're too young, maybe they will change. But one thing that should be added to this rosy picture, and this generation, these very young Russians, seem to be actually very much on good terms with life around them. But to add to this rosy picture is there has never been such an interest in a career in state security in Russia, I mean in post-communist Russia, and also a military career, and this has something to do with what others mentioned at the panel, no longer looks like something unattractive. The opposite is true. But these young people are before their careers. They're mostly students, or at least they don't have regular jobs yet. So that's the picture now, and this explains why they vote for Putin. And they may even say, I don't like this, I don't like that, but they totally buy into a very broad sense in Russia. Who is there who would be better? It's probably wrong to have the same person for such a long time, but he's doing a good job, let him stay. That's very common.
We are, let's see, right here in the red shirt. Is that you, Connor? Yeah, I can see you again.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to hear from you again and meet you again. Actually, for the record, Dr. Phillips helped me publish my first ever article through the Institute for European Studies here at SGIS.
All right.
So thank you very much. My question is something I really want to be more informed about, Russian foreign policy in Latin America. Election coming up in Mexico. There is a, from a certain point of view, a somewhat Trumpian figure on Mexico's version of the left. And there's already signs that Russia has an interest in what's going on there. And I'm wondering how invested they really are compared to their relationship with China and the West. And does Russia have an interest in trying to continue the status quo in Cuba and Venezuela? Or are they more open to changes there and thinking they might be able to take advantage of sudden shifts in those regimes and their stability and the economies overall?
Andrew?
Just quickly, I haven't followed the Mexican elections, but I would imagine that there are some Russian activities similar to some of the means that they use in our elections to support the candidate that they prefer. Latin America is definitely a tertiary or even lower interest area for Russia. But on Venezuela, they actually have kind of doubled down in the last year in supporting the existing government, particularly their investments in the oil sector done by Rosneft there, which look pretty risky.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to chime in on this?
I would only say I think it's quite pragmatic. Venezuela, places where the Russians have some lever, usually in Latin America it's economic and energy related, are targets for them to use those basically to secure positions that are beneficial to them in those sectors. And that seems to be pretty much what's been going on. This is not an ideological campaign particularly. It's one that's based in doing what you can to do well by doing good for your oil industry or whatever. So I think I agree with Andy. It's far away, but if there's an opportunity, they'll take it.
Yes. Morning. Great discussion. Could you wait for the microphone real quickly, Nate? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nate Feltman. Really enjoying the conversation. Appreciate all of you being here. My question is, if sanctions are not necessarily the best answer, expelling diplomats are not necessarily the best answer for extraterritorial actions, whether it's in the UK or whether it's in the Crimea, what are alternatives? What are things that the West and the alliance can do to try to have an impact, a positive impact of pushing back on Putin's actions?
So I think we focus too much on individual pieces. Sanctions are not a strategy. Diplomatic expulsions are not a strategy. They can be, I'm not sure they always are, part of an effective overall strategy. And the strategy that I think is required, and this gets to Sarah's bigger question, is four-pronged. One is, and it goes back to something Andy raised, one is to deter and defend. And I don't just mean in terms of military terms, I mean in cyber terms. In terms of defending American business interests when they are pressured by the Russian government. There's a whole host of ways of deterrent that's not necessarily a military strategy, and that's perfectly legitimate, but it's only part of it. Because much more important, and part of what we tried to do in response to the Russian intervention in Ukraine, is to build the resilience of ourselves and our allies and reduce the vulnerabilities. Andy's exactly right. The Kremlin has the most influence in Europe where those countries are most corrupt. That's one of the reasons they didn't want Ukraine to change. There's a lot of Russian influence in that very corrupt Ukraine. And so corruption in Europe actually is a lever of influence. And I fully agree with Andy that Russia could not have effectively intervened in the US elections if we hadn't made it so easy for them. And so those are things we can do that aren't about punishing Russia or imposing costs on Russia, but reducing our vulnerability. And we should be doing that anyway, because it's in our interest, not just as a part of a Russia strategy, but more generally. And the third is to cooperate where we can. I mean, there are issues on which you cannot get outcomes that are in the American national interest without cooperating with Russia. Arms control among them, non-proliferation certainly among them. And so we should be totally open to that in a pragmatic way. And that is hard to argue for these days in Washington, and it is at risk of being overwhelmed, by the focus on the Russian election interference and various extraterritorial activities. And then the fourth is I want to reinforce keeping the door open between our societies wherever possible. And there are a whole host of policies that we should be implementing. And one of the casualties of the anti-Russian tone in Washington is that there's less willingness in Congress to fund student exchanges, to fund language studies on Russia. Russia has become something of an enemy, and I think that's wrong, and we need to work to make sure that the difference between the actions of a government that are contrary to American interests versus the people of Russia, the country, the society, the business community, is something I think, in the university community really have an obligation to work on.
Yes. Claire?
First of all, thank you very much for attending this conference. Dr. Wallander, you mentioned that an open and global system is the natural enemy of the Putin regime. Unlike China, Russia has open internet access. For all of you, do you believe the internet could be the gate to an open global system, or do you think the internet is simply a tool to strengthen the regime with instruments like trolling and cyber attacks?
It is interesting that there's a difference between Russia and China and the internet, and I won't speak long to this because I think Masha and others will have more to say, but it is intriguing that that is a door left open, and I think it's a sign exactly of how Russia actually did become globalized in the 1990s and the 2000s, and the young people that Masha refers to actually value the ability to see into the outside world, and Russian business people and a lot in the elite would actually, I think, push back. So I think that we shouldn't give up, that there was progress made in supporting Russia's openness and globalization, and there are signs that those elements are still there, and it is an interesting difference from China.
Thank you, Claire. It's an excellent question. I would still say that it's a tool, and as we see, it can be used by different parties in different ways. However, it is really a very important observation that our internet still has a great deal more freedom than in China. The government, ever since 2014 and even before that, has looked at ways at how it can actually impose restrictions on the realm of the internet, and it has succeeded some. But still, for your average user who is interested to read, to watch, to whatever, a young person, it is free. It is free. The restrictions are elsewhere, and they probably will get harder, as internet experts are telling us. But we do not have a firewall. And I would totally agree with what Celeste just said, that it is ironic that Russian people have never been as westernized and as globalized as they are today, as far as the lifestyle is concerned, at least. And it's ironic that against this, we have a policy of, in Russia, I mean, domestic policy of vilifying of anti-American propaganda, anti-Western propaganda, and of course the relations that are deteriorating on a daily basis. I would also, one last point to the previous. I don't think diplomacy is exhausted, the possibility of diplomacy. But when diplomacy is against the background of very angry emotional rhetoric by politicians in the media, it no longer works. When instead of backdoor diplomacy, which I hope Ambassador Collins would agree is still a very efficient way, we have this rhetoric of not only we're expelling your diplomats, but we're expelling your diplomats in order to reduce the espionage on the part of Russia. Now, this is a common understanding that spies, intelligence are working under the cover, but usually it is not said this way.
One of the achievements of the Obama administration was reaching a framework agreement on cybersecurity and cooperation with the Russians in 2013. Unfortunately, those talks were discontinued for a while after Crimea. But I would definitely recommend that you read a book by a colleague journalist of Masha's, Andrei Soldatov, called The Red Web. It's exceptional, very, very insightful. And one thing you take away from it is that Vladimir Putin, from the get-go, was very skeptical about the internet. And he's only become more skeptical over time, that the internet was basically invented by the United States, it's controlled by the United States, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, Masha mentioned the millennial statement. You know, I was teaching the millennial statement last night in my class. That's why I wasn't able to get here until after 2 a.m. this morning. But we read the millennial statement, and every time you read something, you read it with new eyes. And one of the things that caught me this time was right in the beginning, he's referring to some of these changes that are taking place around the globe, and he refers to the information and technology, and he uses, at least I have to go back and see the Russian translation. The English translation for when he talks about cyber and the internet is tempestuous. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah.
Okay, Ambassador Collins will have the last word.
I just want to maybe sum up with 2 or 3 things I would ask you to keep in mind. First, in the question about young people and citizens generally, I think the most singularly important thing I've detected in the society today is 2 elements. One, life is better now than it was in the memory of most people. So they have more choices, they have more options than they could possibly have dreamed about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. That's a pretty big thing. Secondly, the government, for most citizens, is smart enough to leave them alone. Mm-hmm. They conduct their daily lives without reference to liberty or all these large terms we think about. They can read what they want on the internet if they want to. They have got cell phones. You know, there are 240 million cell phones in the Russian Federation. So they're completely wired in. And so they're not feeling controlled in the same sense that we somehow think they are. That's a big plus because fundamentally life is better and they are not feeling the heavy hand of the government particularly. Second thing is, the Russians, whatever we may think about their actions in Ukraine or around it, have a historic preoccupation with security, with the security of their society from outside interference, of danger. You know, they've been invaded from all sides countless times, and it's always ended badly. It's cost lives and treasure and disruption. So you start from a premise of suspicion, distrust, and the sense that you want some guarantees that no one's coming across that border and no one is going to be able to upset your system. Now, there are different reactions to that. In the case of China, the reaction is it's hopeless. So let's just make sure the Chinese keep looking south. And don't worry us. Keep this in a relationship where the Chinese have no reason to challenge us. In the West, what they have seen is, in essence, a Western effort to push closer and closer to their borders. Now, we think this is just letting states choose what they want. But I can tell you, you have to assume that the Russian general staff is preoccupied with the question of, will the 1st Cavalry Division show up on the Ukrainian border? When you talk about Ukraine joining NATO or whatever. We may think this is a crazy thing to be worried about, et cetera, but it is there. And so my last point is, we need to begin to deal with those kinds of problems in the Russian mind if we're going to be able to come to some new arrangements. Not simply dismiss them as ridiculous, but understand that they have a past and so forth, and listen to them and try to figure out, is there a way to deal with these set of issues? I think we haven't done a very good job of it, but we're going to have to come to terms with this.
Thank you, Ambassador Collins. For those of you who are local, I'd like to invite you to follow up on this conversation this Monday evening. We are having an expert panel on the Russian elections. The Russian Studies Workshop is sponsoring this. It will feature Maria Lipman. It will feature Regina Smith from the Department of Political Science, Michael Kimmage from Catholic University of America, and also Nikolai Petrov from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So that's 7 p.m. this Monday at the Neil Marshall Black Culture Center. So thank you to all of our panelists. This was a wonderful discussion. I'm sure the discussion will continue throughout the rest of the day. And thank you to our audience for patiently waiting and participating as well. So thank you.